Good afternoon, Lord Brailsford.
Good afternoon, Miss Stewart. Now, you have a witness for us, please?
I do, my Lord. Giving evidence this afternoon is Miss Kettles, who is the Policy and Engagement Manager at Early Years Scotland, or EYS.
Thank you very much. Yes, when you're ready, Miss Stewart.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Miss Kettles. Can you please confirm your full name for the inquiry?
Yes, it's Lorna and Kettles.
And you've provided a witness statement to the inquiry?
Correct.
And for your Lordship's benefit, that is at reference number WT0642. Now, Miss Kettles, you're the Policy and Engagement Manager at EYS, and that's a role you've held since November 2022.
Yeah, that's right.
And during the pandemic, you were with the same organisation as a policy officer.
Yep, that's right.
How long did you hold that role for?
I started in August 2019, so about 3 years.
Okay. And in terms of your role with EYS during the pandemic, can you tell us a bit about what that involved?
Yeah, so I've done policy for a number of years, and it follows a very similar pattern. Normally, I would be sort of doing consultation responses and calls to evidence and things, but obviously during the pandemic that changed quite significantly, because of the policy landscape and because of the fact that policy was sort of held on hold for that time. So most of my role was concerned around supporting our members and our children and families through making sure that the information that was being provided by the Scottish Government, by the UK Government, by anyone and everyone was accessible, that they could understand it, and that we could kind of support them to deal with any questions or anything that might have arisen from that. There were also a couple of opportunities as the pandemic went on to provide evidence to various kind of calls for evidence committees within the Parliament and things like that. So I dealt with the preparation of that, and I also, my role is sort of half policy, half engagement now, and the engagement side of things really came out during the pandemic, where, because of my background, I was kind of able to provide support to families in terms of applications for sort of benefits, housing, college and university, jobs, that sort of thing. So out in sessions in communities working directly with children and families as well.
That's really helpful. You've answered my next question, because your current role.
Yeah.
In terms of your role during the pandemic, you mentioned information coming from the government. Is that the guidance?
Predominantly, yes. Yes.
The restrictions. Thank you. Now, you're here to give evidence on behalf of EYS.
Yes.
I wonder if you can tell us a bit about that organisation in terms of its purpose, its aims, its membership.
Absolutely, pleasure. So we are the leading national organisation for pre-birth to 5-year-olds in Scotland. We're based in Glasgow, but we are nationwide. There are 4 strands to the work that we do. So there is direct provision of services, where we work within communities and prisons in Scotland, working directly with children and families, predominantly in areas of socio-economic disadvantage, with our trademark Stay, Play and Learn sessions, where children and families are encouraged to learn together, an environment that's sort of known to them. We also have our membership, which is another significant part of the work that EYS does. We represent at present about 1/3 of the early learning and childcare sector in Scotland, and we provide guidance, we provide policies, we support members through inspections, we act as a conduit between the membership and policy and decision makers. There's also professional learning, so we look at supporting the sector to be able to continue their professional learning journeys, providing professional learning opportunities, and then my part of the organisation predominantly, which is policy and advocacy, which is kind of tying that all up into a neat little bow back to policy and decision makers.
That's really helpful, thank you. Before we go on, I just want to remind you to slow down a wee bit.
Sorry.
We've got, and a reminder to myself also, we have stenographers taking a note of the proceedings today, so just if you could try to remember to slow down a bit. You've set out there helpfully, and you have done in paragraph 12 of your statement, the 4 work streams of EYS, and in your evidence today I want to focus on 2 of those. Principally the work you do directly with children and families, and then a very small part of what I ask you will be about the membership and support for the settings.
Okay.
In terms of working directly with young children and families then, you've set out at paragraph 34, and I think you should have your statement in front of you, although you don't need to refer to it, but it's there for you if you want.
Helpful, thank you.
You've spoken about engagement with parents and carers. Why is it that families are so important, or engagement with families is so important to early years delivery?
Well, parents, carers, the family environment is a very important learning environment for children. And as we all know, parenting doesn't come with a manual. You don't get an instruction booklet when you take your baby home from the hospital. And, you know, there are families out there who benefit greatly from additional support and a bit of information and guidance as to how to support their child's learning and development. It's not just about learning, and that's a very niche thing about early learning and childcare. It's learning and care, and the two are completely inextricably linked. But it's very important, and as an organisation we have a very strong family-based ethos. Now, that's not to say that the nursery traditional environment or a childminder isn't great for children, because it is, but we have to recognise that there are families for whom the traditional drop and go model doesn't work, so they should have the ability to be supported in their child's early learning and childcare, and so that's really where we come in. And the first 1,000 days of a child's life is so important that it's really remiss not to provide parents with the level of support that they need.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you about. We heard a little from a witness earlier this morning representing Play Scotland about the importance of play. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you want to add anything there. You've mentioned the first 100 days and the importance of that. I mean,
play is so important, you know, and you'll have heard that this morning. I don't need to wax lyrical about that again, but babies develop from the off, and they're developing every single day, so it's really, really important. And you know, a lot of people maybe think that there's no point in playing with a baby because they don't understand, they can't talk, they can't communicate, but everything that is done in an interaction with a child is helping to support their development. So it's really, really important that those who are primary caregivers, parents and children, and primary educators have the tools to be able to do that, because that is that first 1,000 days from the moment that baby's born, they are ready to take on knowledge and information to be able to develop. So it's really, really important that they have the opportunity to learn through play from that early stage and beyond.
That leads me on to asking you about the informal learning settings that you speak about. Yeah. In your statement, you mentioned Stay, Play and Learn a short while ago, and your statement makes mention of BookBug. Can you tell us a little bit about the delivery of these informal settings? Yeah, so an informal setting is generally a child's first kind of interaction with early learning and childcare, most commonly in the likes of parent and toddler groups, play groups, our sort of community-based sessions, the likes of your BookBug within your local libraries, and other activities, baby sensory, baby massage, and that kind of thing. And they're really important. It's really important that children have the opportunity to socialise in very broad terms with other children, because they learn from other babies as well, and also that parents have that kind of level of peer support. And that's where Early Years Scotland certainly, I'd say we really thrive in the work that we do within communities, because our practitioners build really strong relationships with the families, but also allow the families to build that for themselves. So it's really about empowering, and those informal settings, sometimes, a lot of the times as well, those sort of things can be quite expensive. So the likes of BookBug, which is available in a library, or the Early Years Scotland sessions, which you don't pay for, provide that really important first sort of exposure to other children, to other parents and carers, and to the notion of early learning and childcare itself. Okay. Thank you. One aspect of EYS's work I want to focus on with you is the work that's done in prison settings. Okay. You mention at paragraph 18, I think it is, about the Family Visitor Centre at Lomos. And you also set out a bit later on about service level agreements with Stirling and with other prisons. Yeah. Does that fall under the banner of informal learning, or is that formal?
No, it's not formal. So what I mean by formal is anything that is Care Inspectorate registered and is inspected by the Care Inspectorate of Education Scotland. So that is a nursery, childminder, that sort of thing. But what we provide within the prisons, and I must say we are immensely proud of the work that we do within prisons in Scotland, it genuinely is life-changing. And you mentioned the visitor centres very briefly. We run the visitor centre at Lomos. All families who are visiting a loved one who is in prison there will have access to a family engagement practitioner and a family support worker prior to going into a visit. It's a really trauma-informed space where all children, because it's not just early years in that setting, all children are welcomed and are made to feel nice and calm and supported prior to going in to visit the loved one, because obviously it can be quite a daunting experience. But the work that we do within the other prisons, and for example, here in Edinburgh, we do it in HMP Barlinnie. You mentioned Stirling. We also have Greenock, and we're about to start in HMP Perth as well. So that's more working very much directly with the imprisoned parent to continue that level of bond with their child. So we run what we call the Father's Programme and the Mother's Programme in Stirling, which is a 12-week, not a parenting programme because that sounds very prescriptive, but it's a programme to support parents. They learn baby massage on the baby massage dolls, they learn about child development, they learn about play, the importance of play, and then are given the opportunity to put those into practice during a family visit. So it's really about making sure that families who are affected by imprisonment still have that attachment, if they want it, at that very early stage, because obviously children grow really, really quickly. So it's really important for those who are in prison, and it also gives them that bit of support. And we work with some parents who maybe don't even have access to their children, but still it allows them to understand how their child is developing and that sort of thing. So it's really about empowering that parent while they're in the situation that they're in, to keep that bond up and to understand how their child's developing.
That's really helpful, Chaz. Thank you. In connection with the closure of ELC settings, you mentioned a bit about your membership. Does that cover childminders, nurseries?
Yeah, so early learning and childcare is an exceptionally complicated landscape, I will admit to that, and I'm still working my way through it, nearly 6 years on, but our membership covers the sort of regulated formal nurseries, childminders, but nurseries, there's lots of different aspects there. You've got your local authority nurseries, and then private, voluntary and independent, or as we call PVI nurseries. Our membership is predominantly made up of PVI settings. We have some childminders, but obviously there is an organisation specifically for childminders, but we do work very closely with SCMA. We also have unregulated members, so your parent and toddler groups, your play groups, that kind of thing, and sort of students who are perhaps studying early learning and childcare, or just those who have got an interest in the topic, can become members of Early Years Scotland. But yeah, predominantly it's your nurseries, and mostly PVI nurseries we represent.
In terms of looking at the impacts of closure of the ELC settings, I want again to focus on the prison-based settings that you spoke about there, and you explained about a trauma-informed environment. Can you explain a little to us about the impact of the cessation of these in-person sessions? Absolutely.
It really did have an impact. So as I've alluded to previously, children grow quite quickly. So visiting is a really important way of keeping children and their imprisoned parent engaged. And when those stopped, it had an impact both on the child and on the parent. Obviously, we have a close relationship with the parents that we work with who are imprisoned, and just found it obviously very difficult not to be able to see their children, concerned about the fact that there was something going on in the outside world which they were a little bit sheltered from, albeit the virus did sort of come into prisons, but they were sort of sheltered from the impact. So they were really, really focused on the fact that they were unable to see their families, which made it very difficult. And obviously children, a huge impact. A child will always know who someone is if they're kept in their life, but if you don't see someone for a while, it can be very jarring. There was virtual visits, which were a really great initiative, and they continue on to this day, where imprisoned parents have access to a setup much like this, and they can, sort of see into their family home and see, and it's monitored at both ends, and they can interact with their family there. But that's very difficult. Have you ever tried to keep a young child in front of a screen for more than 2 minutes? It's impossible, regardless of the fact that it's a parent on the screen. It's really hard for them to keep engaged. So we did quite a lot of work, created our virtual visit boxes, and supported the parents to read stories to their children, and puppets, and they were thematic. So to try and keep that engagement going, but it was very difficult. And what was actually really interesting was the imprisoned parents said it was really hard to see the home environment, because they were away from it. That's, you know, by virtue of the fact of where they are, it's not something they would see. So they're watching life carry on as normal in their own home, so they found that very, very difficult as well. So it really did have quite a significant impact, and it meant that when things opened back up again and when parents were allowed to see their children again, it was quite difficult because the kids had perhaps forgotten what it was like to be in that environment. You know, it's quite a daunting environment if you've not been in it before, and also the parents had to wear masks, so it was difficult for the child to interact fully with their parent because they were wearing a mask, so they couldn't see their face, they couldn't communicate in the way that they had been over the screen. So it just made it really, really quite difficult, and it really did have an impact on the little ones, and it took a long while. You know, we've built up really good relationships between the families all together, and it really did take a good bit of work to be able to kind of try and pull that back together again.
You've mentioned there about restrictions other than what we call lockdown. That's something I want to come to a bit later on, but sticking first of all with the cessation of these in-person visits and the ELC settings within prisons, you talked about a trauma-informed approach being possible because of the environment. Was it possible to recreate that on screen?
Very difficult, very, very difficult. You know, the whole point of a trauma-informed environment that we create in the sessions and our settings that we hold there is that it's calm and that it's, you know, there's soft lighting, there's fidget toys for the children to play with. It's the colours are selected very specifically. So if it's virtually, then it's a home to something else environment. So it makes it very difficult to keep that kind of trauma informed. I mean, you know, we can provide the tools to the parents, both the imprisoned parents and the families at home, but yeah, it really was very difficult to keep that going. And again, that's something that we worked really hard with the parents to create, so that they knew that the visits weren't going to be stressful or anything like that for their children. So yeah, really difficult to keep that going.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just being reminded again to ask you to slow down a little bit. Sorry, I'm sorry about that. It's difficult, but if you could please just try to remember to slow down. We want to make sure we capture all that you're saying. You mentioned a bit about working within restrictions, and obviously ELC settings and other education settings were open as hubs during the pandemic. Can you explain a little to us about how ELC settings in the main operated as hubs? Were they aligned with primaries, or were they alone as they would otherwise be? Yeah, so we didn't have a huge amount to do with the hub settings, predominantly because we were trying to support our members to, you know, there was a lot of financial concerns, there was the concerns of the development of children. So, I mean, in terms of what we know was that they were central, they were facilitated by the local authority. Often it would be a case that a hub setting would encompass early learning and childcare and primary, sometimes secondary school, depending on the environment, and they were predominantly staffed by local authority staff. But that's really all that I can kind of give you about that, as I say, because we really didn't have very much to do with them. You mentioned there about the local authorities operating the hubs. Were they operating them in terms of eligibility as well? Yes. So there was criteria. It was key workers. So initially it was very much sort of healthcare workers, you know, frontline services, and then that got widened more to include early learning and childcare workforce, people working in shops, those providing essential services. So there was a criteria. So families would apply for their child to be at a hub setting, and then it would be decided through the criteria whether they were eligible or not. And is the same true for the eligibility for vulnerability? For the eligible twos? For the vulnerable children. Yes, but that's very difficult because, again, it was a self-referral, an application, and a family is not going to want to admit, you know, in the main that's the situation that they're in. So there were probably a lot of vulnerable children, not a word that we use in EYS, vulnerable children who were eligible but did not take up spaces for a variety of reasons. Was it possible, you mentioned their self-referral, was it possible for the settings who knew the children and the families to make that referral for them? Or? Yeah,
I think so, probably. Again, I couldn't say definitively yes or no, but the onus did seem to be, because not all settings were open, so it's very difficult in the settings where, you know, trying to keep their families going and make sure they were okay. So I couldn't definitively say whether that was the case or not.
That's really helpful, thank you. Just one more question on hubs before we move on. You mentioned at paragraph 89 that childminders, who you say are a small proportion of your membership, that they didn't operate as hubs. The inquiry understands that they did stay open during the pandemic, so that's perhaps something different, and they did offer childcare to the children of key workers and some vulnerable children. Is that your understanding also?
Yes, and I think in the use of the word hub there, it's more about a central location is probably what was meant by that. Yeah.
That's helpful, and that's perhaps something you mentioned SCMA.
Yeah, without a doubt, SCMA will have much more information on that. They only work with childminders, so they'll be able to give you significantly more about that.
And for your Lordship's benefit, SCMA is the Scottish Childminders Association, an organisation from which we will hear in evidence. I want to speak to you now, Ms Kettles, about reopening and operating with restrictions. And at paragraph 115, you make reference to getting it right for every child, or GERFIC, as it's commonly referred to, and that, for your Lordship's benefit, is the Scottish Government's policy commitment and their framework to promote, support and safeguard the well-being of children and young people. And in mentioning that framework, Ms Kettles, you expressed at paragraph 115 that there were challenges in realising children's rights due to the restrictions. I wonder if you can expand on that for us.
Of course. So GERFIC is based on UNCRC, which is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that sets out very clearly and very definitively rights of children which should be realised, and GERFIC's always been modelled on that. And we're very proud of that in Scotland, and rightfully so. It was very difficult for young children to be able to have their rights realised, predominantly because of the pressures, I think I would say, on the staff within settings. So guidance was long. There were big, meaty documents. Early learning and childcare is an exceptionally guidance-led sector as it is. There's a lot we have to take into consideration. There was a lot more we had to take into consideration with the reopening guidance. And so something really basic like the right to play. So yes, children were back in a setting, so in theory they were able to play. However, those rights weren't being fully realised because they weren't allowed to sing, and they were only allowed to be with certain groups of children. And that's very difficult. That was so challenging for settings. So hard to keep children away from other children and in a bubble or a group or whatever. And also, you know, so there's like rights of association, which they technically weren't getting. Little things like, you know, the GERFIC and the missionary indicators that go with that. Safe is something around about that. Children weren't allowed to take their comforters, their little bears or their little blankets or whatever to nursery, because obviously concerns around cross-contamination. But again, it's just taking that something away from a child that forms part of that GERFIC framework. Now, don't get me wrong, settings worked their absolute hardest to realise children's rights as much as they could, by trying to provide an environment, a normal environment for them after, you know, everything that they'd been through from being in lockdown, to coming back to nursery or maybe coming into nursery for the first time. So yeah, we were just really concerned as an organisation that although they were still back in with their peers, so they were still associating and they were still playing, that they weren't being able to do that to the fullest degree because of the pressures faced by the staff who were looking after them.
And you mentioned there the guidance, the pressures in connection with the guidance.
Yeah, so infection prevention and control, which is something that we've already always been very strict on in ELC, was further manifested. things like parent and carer drop-off. So a parent could no longer go into their child's setting and have a chat with their key worker. Oh, she's had a bad night, or he's had a bad night, or they've slept well, or whatever. It was a drop-off at the door, and then off they went, and then a pick-up at the door again. So you're losing that little bit of kind of interaction that you have with the person that's looking after your child. You're also not seeing the environment that your child's learning in and developing in, which, you know, for a parent, is difficult, because you want to see what they're doing and their art on the walls, and, you know, just the space that they're in, especially if it's a new environment, if it's a child who's not been in a setting before, this is their first time. You know, there were restrictions on blended placements. So when the expansion of early learning and childcare came about, the 1140, as I'll call it, because that's what we call it, blended placements was a really big focus, because we wanted families to have the choice of where their children went. So they might take a day with a childminder and a couple of days with a nursery, or, you know, do it so they could use their funding however they saw fit as a family, and it kind of really solidified that element of choice. But blended placements were discouraged during the pandemic, again, which we can understand, worried about cross-contamination, but it kind of flew in the face of something that we'd been working towards as a sector to support a family in the round, who were then told, well, no, actually, you can't do that. So they were having to make a choice. Well, you can send your child to this setting or this setting. We'd rather that you didn't do both. And that's the local authority that obviously grants the funding. So they were kind of having an eye on that. Children couldn't play with things that they would normally play with: sand, water, making Play-Doh, anything. Children like being messy, and they like getting their hands into things, whether it's gloop or whether it's Play-Doh or what, you know, and we couldn't do that, obviously, and again, for obvious reasons, because we were worried about the spread of the virus. But it's just things like that children were missing out a little bit on. Eating together, you know, you stick to your own packed lunch, and you've got to, you know, it was just really, it was restrictive, and it's such a time for children where everything's a learning opportunity for a child in an early learning and childcare setting. So staff are having to rethink how they provide those learning opportunities in a way that's not going to adversely impact the child, because they're always thinking about the next steps and going to school and that child growing up. But it's about how that first 1,000 days, the first 5 years of a child's life, were being able to carried out in a way that would keep them learning the things they should be learning, and allowing them to take risks. And we noticed that massively. So, you know, guidance would outdoors was great, but there was a while where kids couldn't go to the park. So they'd come back to nursery and there'd be a slide, and they'd be frightened to go down it, or they didn't know how to go down it, because those kind of opportunities had been taken away. So there was a lot less risky play, which is really, really important, again, for a child's learning and development.
I want to come on to speak to you just in a short while about the various impacts, some of them that you've touched on there. But before I move on to that, sticking with the restrictions just now, and you mentioned a bit about this in connection with the prisons, you say at paragraph 126 that there's been an increase in ASN as a result of mask wearing.
Yeah.
Can you explain what ASNs in particular has increased and how it is you know that?
Absolutely. So the additional support need that we're really focusing on in that response is speech and language. All children, but Early Years Scotland's been working with the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. They kind of reached out to us and said, we're a bit concerned because we're getting more referrals, and is this something that you've seen? And we said, well, yeah, we've noticed that. So from working with that organisation, it became quite clear that there were quite significant gaps in children's speech and language therapy, and as with most things, that was more evident in children from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. Children will learn from looking, so sound forming is something that a very young child will respond to, but they have to be able to see how someone's making a sound for them to learn how to do it. It's a mimicking thing almost, and you can't tell if someone's wearing a mask. You know, if you're changing a baby's nappy, for example, which happens in nurseries every day, if you can't look at that baby, they can't tell what kind of experience they're having. They can't tell if the person doing it is smiling at them or if the baby's lying down and going to sleep. And, you know, there's no half the face is obscured, so that means that half of the ability of a very young child to learn is obscured. So yeah, we were really, really concerned about that, and the kind of impact that would have going forward, and the number of young children who are now at primary school, let's face it, with speech and language developmental delays because of that, because of not being able to see faces, and also because of not being able to babble with their peers, and that's quite a big impact as well. But certainly the masks, we were really, really fought to have that taken out of the guidance, so that the key worker, the person within that setting who was looking after the child, could fully look at and focus on the child to support their learning and development.
And the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy is an organisation we'll be hearing from next week, so we can pick up on that with them. But for the time being, you've mentioned more about what you've said at paragraph 140, and you refer in particular to a Times educational supplement article which was written in conjunction with the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy, and in particular that focuses on the mask wearing issue. So again, that's something that we can raise with that witness. I want to spend a bit of time now with you talking through the impacts, some of which you've mentioned there. You set these out at paragraph 128 and following, and you set out a number of areas which were impacted by lockdown and by other restrictions. For example, you speak about impacts on motor skills, social, emotional and linguistic development, sleep, play, personal skills, and so on. Can I first of all ask you, how are you aware of these impacts? Was it through a survey perhaps, or through your engagement with members?
Yeah, so Public Health Scotland did an early use resilience and impact survey, which we sort of collaborated on, we shared with our members, we were involved in the kind of dissemination of, to find out how restrictions had impacted on children, and it found that that had happened quite negatively, but also, yes, very much so, from our direct service provision in communities, and we could see the impacts and the concerns that members were coming to us with about much of what you'd outlined there. So it was a kind of a very much a landscape of the ELC sector, from that survey by Public Health Scotland to our own work and our own kind of, we've done a couple of member surveys as well during the time about the impact on children, and just kind of anecdotally from our practitioners who were witnessing and observing the differences in children who had been away and came back following restrictions.
That's helpful. I'm not sure we'll have time to go through each of these impacts in today's hearing, but I want to focus just now for a short time on the impact on children's social and emotional development, and you've got that at paragraph 128. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about how children's social development was impacted.
Yeah, in a number of ways, to be honest. First of all, if we think about the socialisation in general, in that they just really weren't able to. So that's very, very broad and very basic. But if you kind of, young children are often looked after by another family member, a grandparent, an aunt and uncle, who, while parents or carers are at work themselves. So they stop being able to see those family members. That's difficult because it's a change in routine. So, a child wonders where the person's gone. And then again, when that person's reintroduced back into their life, it's difficult. It takes them a while to catch up on interacting with them, because they, whether it was the initial kind of 9 weeks of very, very restrictive lockdowns, it's a long time in the life of anyone under 3. So that was really impacted. Obviously, very sadly, some children had family members pass during the time. So they went from maybe spending time with this grandparent or whoever, and then they just weren't there anymore. And that was very difficult. And so we had to kind of look at how children would deal with bereavement and grief, because that was something that it wasn't new, but it was very different, circumstances. And I think probably most fundamentally was the interaction with their peers. They learn, children don't necessarily play with each other. They'll play beside each other, depending on age and stage. They'll get to that stage where they are playing together, but in the main, they're kind of just aware of another child, and then they're aware of another child playing beside them. And that's how they learn to do things like share, because, there's two children in one set of blocks, so they've got to share the blocks. That opportunity didn't, present itself, so that became quite difficult. Sorry.
Take your time.
That became quite difficult. They didn't, there was babies who had never seen another baby, which is just, when you think about it, is really crazy, but they didn't. They never, you know, other than themselves, maybe in a mirror or on FaceTime, they'd never seen another baby. So that very natural interaction that happens at a parent and toddler group or a stay, play and learn session where they're kind of on the floor together, aware of that other little person or those other little people, that was taken away as well. So they didn't have that same level of social development. And things like, you know, maybe parents going to, as happens a lot of the time with parents that come to our groups, they'll then go out all together for a coffee or they'll go for a play date. So relationships were that would organically be formed in those circumstances weren't able to be formed because they weren't having any interaction with each other.
In terms of their emotional development, how was it that was impacted?
So I think in terms of emotionally, again, regulation, emotional regulation was a big one, because again, children learn by looking at and observing others. So because they weren't always faced with opportunities in which they would have to regulate their emotions, they didn't. So they didn't learn to do it. And a lot of the time, a lot of our families, parents were working from home, and it was super, super challenging, especially if you had a child under 3, which I had myself at the time, a child of that age who needed your attention, but you also had to work. So there's that really horrible rub between, I'm just going to give in to you so you don't get upset. So they didn't have the same opportunities to you know, be told, no, you can't do this, or, you know, you're upset because of this, but let's work through it, or you're happy because of this. You know, those kind of joyful moments in terms of emotions that come out, in terms of, you know, like flowers blooming and, you know, all those kind of things. They didn't have the opportunity for that because they were really, really quite stuck in. And that then has an impact on a child's mental health. Earlier Scotland, I think about 2 years ago, we were commissioned by the government as part of the mental health joint delivery board to do a piece of work around young children's mental health, wellbeing and happiness. And we worked with early years practitioners, we worked with families of children in early years settings and also who had just left, and also with in the workforce, I'd said that. And one of the things we found were that children, it was cuddles. So if a child is upset, they want a cuddle. So we weren't allowed to, I mean, their parents could cuddle them, but that was all. So it's things like that which were very natural reactions to a child if they were having emotional distress or whatever, that weren't able to be demonstrated in the same way. So that was, again, something else that had to be caught up on at the time.
You mentioned a little bit before about parental engagement and parental contact at drop-off. And you mentioned at paragraph 163 that there was an impact on the loss of that parental engagement. Can you explain a little bit to us about the importance of that engagement? Yeah,
absolutely. So as a parent, you hand your child over, if you're putting your child into a nursery or a childminder, whatever setting it might be, and you hand your child over entrusted in the most precious thing that you have in your life. The person who is receiving that child, whether it's a childminder or a key worker or whoever works in the setting, knows your child, but needs to know how your child's been. Children aren't necessarily in a setting 5 days a week. They might only be in for a couple of days. Also, there was a global pandemic. There was a lot going on in homes that we didn't, you know, that might not have been, children might not have been exposed to previously. So not to be able to leave your child at a door and just wave without saying, can I have 2 minutes with you, because actually she's really not been sleeping and I'm really worried and I would like your expert advice as a practitioner as to how I can support this. They didn't have that opportunity. And yes, you could email or you could phone up, but there's something about that human interaction of just being able to talk. And I think we see it generally with the kind of rise in, you know, meetings online and that sort of thing, that you can never fully tell how a person is if you're looking at them through a screen or talking to them. Whereas if you've just got that couple of minutes at the start of the day, or, you know, imagine a parent going to pick their child up and their child being handed over and there's a note that said, he took his first steps today. Not, come in, this is where he did it, he walked, you know, just those really basic things. And that was really sad. But also I think it's really important to be aware of how important a relationship between parents and carers and early years setting is. early years practitioners, or whatever they're called, because they've got a couple of different names, have got really trusted relationships, and families build up really trusted relationships with them. And staff, certainly our staff within Early Years Scotland, we have family engagement practitioners. We have had disclosures of domestic abuse. We have had families coming and saying, this has happened and we don't know what to do and we don't know where to turn. So that crisis level was also being missed somewhat, because you're not going to phone somebody up or email them and say, oh, by the way, I think I'm experiencing domestic abuse. But the relationships that get built up within ELC settings, a worker can look at a mum or a dad and go, something not right with you, what's wrong, have that conversation, and then support them from there. So that was something that was really lost as well.
Thank you. There's just one other aspect of these impacts you raised that I want to bring out just now, and that's the impact on transitions. And I'm thinking of transition to early learning settings, and I'm thinking now of formal settings. Yeah. And transitions, you mentioned blended learning between the settings and then on to primary school. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about how that was impacted? Yeah, absolutely. So, to be perfectly honest, transitions aren't always handled best. Possibly I'm talking more moving to school. It's different when a child's starting a setting, they're given the opportunity to settle in and that kind of thing. So what would normally happen is a parent or carer would write, this is where my child's going, so they would go to the nursery or the childminder or wherever it was for an hour with their child. They'd either sit in the room with their child or they'd sit in another room but their child would be there, and there'd be a phased, that would be phased so that the parent felt comfortable to leave their child in a setting while they went and went to work, and that they knew the child was safe and happy and whatever. Didn't have that. So it was literally, you're dropping your child off at a door and hoping that they're okay, not knowing. So obviously parental mental health was kind of through the roof at that point, because people were so worried about whether their children were getting on okay, whether they weren't getting on okay, and just you get a feel for somewhere. It's like anything. You can only get a feel for something if you go into it. So, parents often will go into a nursery or whatever and go, actually, I don't think this is for me. I don't, for whatever reason. So they didn't have that option. And school transitions were really hard. School transitions are hard anyway. You expect these little tiny people who have got all this freedom and are able to do, whatever they want within a nursery setting, to then go to this building, which they may never have been to in their life before, and go in there and sit and do as they're told. And, it's a very different environment. And some schools really do take a play-based learning approach, and that's great, but they don't all. So it's a huge thing anyway. And when you've got a setting, like I said previously, PVI settings, the kind of private, voluntary, independent, where people are fee paying mostly in there, families come from everywhere. So it's not as if that kind of traditional model of 25 years ago where all the children would go to the nursery that was attached to the school and they'd all go to the school from there. So it's quite difficult to manage anyway. If you add a situation into that where visitors can't come in, so, what's quite common is that if there's a couple of children in a setting going to a school, a teacher from that school would come in. Couldn't do that, or could, but there had to do this and that and the next thing, and it depended on which part of the pandemic we were in. So that was really, really stilted. So then again, it's you've got your child through, I use the word trauma to describe COVID, and I think it is relevant because everybody went through. It was a trauma for everyone in one way or another. So you've got these little people, these resilient little people who, despite everything, are getting on, and they're they've got all their challenges, but they've got through that kind of nursery. They've not been able to have a graduation, and I know a lot of people laugh at a graduation, but they shouldn't, because it's a really important transition. It's showing a child that they are now at a stage where they're moving up to school, that kind of thing. So that was taken away, and it's just there was perhaps short-sightedness on how it would impact on the child by not allowing that to happen versus the policy that had to be adhered to. Did that impact information sharing between settings, between ELC and primary, for example?
Not formally, because the nursery would send a learning journal or information to the school and vice versa. But it was more, again, about that face-to-face contact, or the child being able to visit the school that they were going to go to more than once, because there would maybe be one invitation where they could go one time and that was it. But I think in terms of information sharing, that was probably okay, because most of that's done kind of digitally and whatnot.
And again, thinking about disproportionate impacts, did the absence of these transitions impact some cohorts of children more than others?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the children who are now, goodness, it just seems like such a long time ago, but the children who are now sort of primary 2, primary 3, no, actually, I'd say a bit older than that, who didn't have those leaving nursery traditions, and who weren't seeing their families, and who weren't allowed to go to the park, and that the ones who went to school right in the thick of it at the very start, so the 2020 starters, for them it was normal. But now that things are back to normal, and that the school day looks, that everyone's fallen back to the way things were, that's different for those children. Also, bearing in mind that, the ones coming after them have got those speech and language concerns and the delays. So it's impacting on the schools as well, because they've had to deal with children who, for all intents and purposes, because of their age, were school ready, but who didn't get the opportunity to properly finish their early learning experience and have that preparedness within themselves.
Thank you. Staying just now with disproportionate impacts, you mention in your statement at paragraph 117 about intersecting inequalities, and you talk about parents who are hard to reach. Can you tell me what sort of circumstances may make a parent hard to reach and the impact of that?
Yeah, so hard to reach can be, excuse me.
Take your time.
Horrible cough, sorry, I knew it was going to get me. Hard to reach families, again, a phrase that we don't tend to use because it's quite stigmatising, and I prefer to call them easy to ignore from a policy perspective. But you're talking about perhaps families who are new to Scotland, for whom English isn't a first language. You're talking about really any family who is suffering socioeconomic disadvantage, families with imprisoned parents, families who are perhaps experiencing domestic abuse. There's certain parts of the country where we have big sort of gypsy traveller communities who traditionally don't engage. So, but from our perspective, very much so Earlier Scotland, we work with families who would be considered often hard to reach, and literally without us going to their doors to drop off play packs or food packs, they wouldn't have had any engagement, because they don't know, they're not engaging with other services. Often when a family who would be hard to reach will be brought into a community, because there'll be a community centre, and there'll perhaps be an English as a second language class, or a wee exercise class, or a baby group. But if that's all taken away because you're not allowed to mix and interact with others, then that keeps families away. We have services where most of our families for whom English is a second language, and the benefit that they get from attending is you can see it on a daily basis, and their interaction with the community and their use of community spaces. So if you take that away, then it becomes even more difficult for them to engage and be engaged. And the real concern is that their children, there's things that aren't getting picked up on with their children in terms of health, in terms of perhaps additional support needs, but also the isolation faced by parents who would be considered hard to reach, and how difficult, and a lot of the time those kind of families are living in flats or temporary accommodation. They don't have a garden, they don't have that outdoor space, sometimes they don't even have another room to go into. So taking away something which will allow them to explore a peer network and their local community, and get more involved and have their children integrated and themselves be able to integrate, was taken away, and that really did have an impact.
Okay. I want to ask you now a little bit about the impacts on the workforce working within ELC, and you dedicate a section of your statement to this at paragraph 203 and following. And at 208 in particular, you speak about the impact on the development and training of the staff. Can you tell us a bit about the impact that lack of training has had on the profession?
Yeah, so what's very interesting, which, to be honest, I don't think we fully appreciated until coming out of the pandemic a little bit because we were so busy doing what we were doing. But in order to obtain an early learning and childcare qualification, you have to do practical work. You have to have a placement. You have to go out to an early learning and childcare setting, and you have to interact with children and families. It's part of the assessment process and all that kind of thing. That didn't happen because of the pandemic. So what we're seeing is there are a lot of staff who are in theory qualified and who are theoretically brilliant at their jobs, but who have never sat down in a group and tried to lead a sing-song with children or made Play-Doh with them or spoken to a family about challenging behaviours or anything like that. So that's something that you know, and our sector and our workforce, I mean, our sector is a mess. And that's, you know, that's another story for another day generally. But we're really struggling to recruit and retain staff in early learning and childcare at the moment. So where we do have staff, we don't want them to go. We want to be able to support them, to train them and to develop them. But those kind of barriers are there that, you know, perhaps they've not had the practical experience. That's maybe easing off a little bit now that things are back to normal. But at the time, that was, you know, that was quite difficult because you can teach theory, but you can't always teach interaction. So that was something. And just the kind of, I mean, the early learning and childcare sector is massively undervalued. We're undervalued in terms of societal terms and in financial terms. And it's not a particularly attractive job prospect for a lot of people. It's not seen as very professional. We're seen as people that make macaroni pictures and change nappies. So much more than that. But the low pay and low skilled kind of myth, stigma round about early learning and childcare means that it's not very attractive. So it's hard enough to attract people into the sector. Never mind try and keep the ones that we've got there because, you know, settings were closing because of COVID, so people were losing their jobs, and, you know, the expansion of early learning and childcare put a lot of pressure on a lot of settings, so more staff went and they've left the sector completely. So training and development is a really, really important part of any role, but certainly early learning and childcare because things come up all the time, especially now where we are seeing more children with additional support needs and we don't have the same levels of support, particularly in the PVI sector. There's not a lot of them in local authority nurseries either. But those kind of support members and support staff, who we don't have any longer, and again, a lot of that is because the undervaluing of the workforce. So it's very difficult to then access training because there's not enough staff. So the people that would maybe be on the training can't go to do the training because they've got to be on the floor. You've got nursery managers who are behind in paperwork and things because they're keeping in ratio by being on the floor. So if they can't get time to do their, you know, their care inspector returns of a week, how are they going to get time to do any kind of course or any kind of development and training? So that's a big issue because any workforce should be consistently learning because there's always something new, but it's becoming more and more difficult within our sector because of a lot of external pressures that are on, which were not created by the pandemic, but which were very, very much exacerbated by it.
Sticking with the workforce for the time being, you mentioned there that the ELC workforce, in terms of formal and informal, is predominantly female. How was it that led to them being disproportionately impacted, as you set out at 215, I think?
Yeah, okay, so we know that early learning and childcare is a massively female-dominated sector, and it's again another disproportionate impact. Sorry, can you put that down a wee bit, please?
I beg your pardon, sorry, that was my fault. It starts at 216.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Just to remember what I'd said. Yeah. Yeah. So that's right. So we're talking about a female workforce. We're always told that that we need to get more men into childcare, which would be wonderful, but you don't raise the wages of the women because we want more men in, just raise the wages of the women that do the job anyway, and that's part of the problem. It's low paid, it's low skilled. So we're not valued, and no early learning and childcare worker got the £500 social care payment that was announced by the First Minister back in, I can't remember, it was November 2021 maybe, but social care staff got that payment. Early learning and childcare staff didn't get that payment. The disparities in our sector as it is regardless of the fact that it's predominantly female, mean that the PVI sector are subject to lower pay. They're much less likely to be trade unionised, and their terms and conditions aren't generally as good as those within local authorities. So what you've got is staff who are working in PVI at the moment who see the same role in local authority for a significantly larger wage, so they'll move to local authority. So there's no staff left in PVI. And so PVI will bring in, you know, younger women because they're cheap, because they need people, because it's a really important part of the sector. And what it means is that it's just sorry, I get myself so upset thinking about this because it's just so unjust. But it's all women. They don't get paid very well. They don't get valued very well. So actually, it doesn't matter if they're working in a nursery or does it matter if they're working in Aldi, because actually, if they go and work in a supermarket, they're going to get paid the same, but they're not going to have the same hassle. So we'll leave the sector. So what that leaves is a massive gulf in terms of expertise. You know, there's women who have worked in our sector for years who, following the pandemic, have gone, I can't do this anymore. So you're losing expertise, you're losing knowledge, and ultimately that's impacting on the children. Because
and what was it about the pandemic that made them make that decision? Was it purely financial?
No, it was just I think a lot of it was the undervaluing, was the nobody clapped on a Thursday night for early learning and childcare workers. We're always seen as a bit of a Cinderella service, generally. We do all, you know, we're in the background burrowing away. But we don't always get the recognition. And I think it was just a kind of a culmination of things. And the pandemic was really difficult, again, with the disparities between local authority and PVI. Local authority settings don't have to worry about paying their rent or paying their, you know, their electricity bills or that kind of thing, because that's covered by the local authority. So PVI sector are having to deal with with all of those things, and are receiving less of a funded rate per child than the local authorities are. So they've got less money. Now, yes, they are private businesses, but they are working under the same guidance and documents. Everyone works under the same guidance and documents in the early learning and childcare sector. So there's really strict things that they have to adhere to. But as they have less and less money, they either have to charge their parents more, which nobody wants to have to do, or they have to really look at their staff's wages. Okay. And everything's predominated on being paid the real living wage. So those who provide early learning and childcare, eligible early learning and childcare, must be paid at least a living wage. So what that's doing is creating a race to the bottom, because it's saying that that's all that they are worth, and they go, do you know what, I could get more money working somewhere else, so that's what I'm going to go and do. And so I think it was just kind of a culmination of things.
And business and welfare is one of the themes that the inquiry is looking at. So in terms of the private settings you've mentioned there, that's something that we can pick up on. I want, just in the last sort of 10 or 15 minutes or so, to speak to you about your support for your members. And you've outlined today, and you do so at paragraph 73, about the interpreting and representing of government guidance, and that was a important part of your role. You mentioned at 73 there that there was confusion about the published guidance, I beg your pardon. Yeah. Can you explain a bit for us about the nature of that confusion? Yeah, so every time, there were about 12 iterations of the reopening guidance for early learning and childcare settings, and there was 2 separate sets of guidance. So there was for formal settings, regulated settings, and then for informal. So, but both sets, every time a new set of guidance came out, it looked the same. There wasn't enough definition as to where the changes had been. There was no quick way of a setting going, can I still do this or do I need to still do that? Because it all kind of fed through each other. So they were having to really essentially read another 52-page document a couple of weeks later. Sometimes it was really only minor changes. So I think, talking about the confusion, it wasn't necessarily confused about what they had to do because of the guidance. There was frustration because of what had to be done because of the guidance. And there was concern as to how it was all going to be able to be done. But the confusion would come when something new would come out, and it would just look the same. So that's why Early Years Scotland decided to create a kind of easy read version for our members. So what I did with that was sort of condense it. So rather than it being 52 pages, would pull out the relevant information and make it maybe half the size of that, and then highlight anything that was taken out or added in. So
all settings had to do was look for the bit of blue highlight, and they could see that it was either something new that they had to do or something that they no longer had to do. And it just made it a bit easier, because we were so aware they were getting bombarded with information left, right and centre, you know, trying to keep themselves going. So there was a lot of stuff around kind of the furlough and all that stuff. There was everything about child protection and all that, and then there was this more guidance of how to reopen their settings. So yeah, we just wanted to make it as easy as possible to make people aware that this was what was changed or put back to what you were used to, so they weren't having to read big lengthy documents, basically.
Thank you. The other aspect of membership and support I want to speak to you about is regulation and inspection. You've mentioned already that the settings required to be registered with the Care Inspectorate. You set out at paragraph 218 that following the nature of the Care Inspectorate's inspections changed, and you set out that the inspections became, in your view, tougher. I wonder if you can explain a bit to us about, first of all, how the inspections changed.
Of course. So inspections, the Care Inspectorate resumed inspections fairly quickly compared to Education Scotland, in terms of their inspection of both early learning and childcare and school settings.
Did they cease completely in March
They ceased completely,
2020?
yes. So they stopped completely, obviously purely because people couldn't go in and out of settings. But when the guidance was restricted somewhat, the Care Inspectorate would it kind of went back out a lot earlier. So what you had was, and this is all coming from members, this is all coming from what members have told us, that they were trying to get back on their feet, and that's part of where the confusion around the guidance comes from, because members were really worried that if there was an aspect of the guidance that they weren't adhering to, whether that, you know, because it was so big, so things could be missed, then that would have an impact on their Care Inspectorate grades. They'd be marked down. Obviously, in order to receive funded entitlement as a setting, you have to meet specific Care Inspectorate grades, so that's really important as well. But it was just felt that the Care Inspectorate came back out quite quickly and were harsh, and every member that we spoke to about this, because we did go out and specifically asked, until about now, none of the people that we spoke to, the settings, were getting higher grades. They were generally getting marked down. And so there was just this kind of really horrible uncertainty that everything was just kind of getting back on its feet. Settings were trying to support their children and make sure that their best interests were catered for, and adhere to the guidance that was there, and deal with staff absences as well, because obviously during that time there were still the restrictions around where you could go to your work or not. So, you know, settings were staffed down, they were having to close rooms. So can you imagine the level of stress if somebody from the Care Inspectorate walks in and goes, I'm here to inspect you, and you're down 3 members of staff because they've tested positive for COVID, and, you know, you're trying to keep your infection prevention and control on the go, and somebody's brought in a teddy, and it's the fact that someone brought in a teddy going to give you a lower grade. You know, it was just a really, really uncertain time. And I think it's not about the being inspected per se, because any ELC setting will tell you that it's really important to have a level of scrutiny, you know, and nobody's denying that. And it is really important to have a level of scrutiny, but it's just the way it was done. It wasn't felt to be very supportive. It wasn't felt to be very, is there anything we can do to help you, given this massive thing that's happened? It was very much, right, well, your window was shut there, so we're going to have to mark that down. Or, you know, like, the room wasn't, that room didn't have enough staff in it, so you had to bring someone in from this other room. But actually that was because you had other staff off who were you know, ill or whatever. So
you mentioned there about grading. Is a grade given to each setting at the point of inspection?
Yeah, so members, Care Inspectorate, it's quite confusing. So there's Care Inspectorate and Education Scotland have 2 separate grading systems, although they are moving to a shared inspection framework. But at present, Care Inspectorate goes from 1 to 6. So obviously with 6 being the top end and 1 being the lower end. So there's aspects of each setting that will be graded, which will then create an overall grading. So it's environment and staff and, you know, children's kind of learning and care, and there's criteria to be followed. So each aspect will be graded to create an overall grade.
And which aspect of that grading was it that led to there being, what you mentioned a short while ago, a downgrading?
It just depended. It depended on the inspector. It depended on, you know, probably a lot of the time it was staff because, you know, staff weren't necessarily there because they were off ill. But it very much, although it's a framework, very much depends on the inspector as to how they perceive something happening on the day. And the other thing about a care inspection is it's one day. Sometimes goes into two, but generally it's a very, very tight snapshot of what's happening on a day-to-day basis in a setting. So if one thing goes wrong, as it invariably does sometimes, you can guarantee that's the day that it happens. So it really just depends on the setting, the day, and the inspector that was there.
And what could have been done to maintain the scrutiny you say is so important and to provide the support?
Just support, just coming at it from a maybe not resuming inspections quite as quickly, or giving settings a bit of notice about it, because care inspector will just pop out. There's no, they don't, you know, it used to be that they would give a pre-inspection questionnaire so that the setting would know that there was an inspection coming up. That's not the case. So just a little bit of preparation to be able to say, we're coming out next week, and for the setting to say, well, actually, we've had to close our baby room because we've got 3 members of staff who have tested positive for COVID, so that's just to make you aware of that. So it's almost as if the settings weren't given the opportunity to explain themselves. You know, and I'm not saying that if there was something that they shouldn't have been doing, that shouldn't have been picked up on in terms of the fundamental aspects of the care inspectorate framework, but just a bit more notice and a bit more support and a bit more awareness, because that's something that, you know, obviously the inspectors have a job to do, and again, like we say, scrutiny is important, but support's really important as well. So often it's just about the approach that you take. So I think settings would have just felt a lot better if they had a bit of awareness that it was coming up the tracks and the opportunity to sort of explain themselves a bit more. And you can challenge grades, but if you've just gone through a stressful inspection that happened when you didn't know what was going to happen, and everyone's really stressed out, sometimes it's easier to just go, right, we'll go again, and, you know, take it from there. So it's just that kind of, just the support and awareness just could have been a bit more sensitive, maybe might be the right word.
I've just got one more question for you. You set out in this final paragraphs at 241, you say it's only now EYS is really seeing the real impact of the pandemic. I want to give you the chance just now to speak about any key lessons you think should be applied to make sure these impacts, we've spoken about the impacts on the settings, the children, the workforce, and there you've spoken about impacts in connection with regulation of that. Is there anything you think should be applied to try and address these impacts and mitigate them?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly very basic things like talking back about speech and language, and I mentioned previously that very unlikely to get speech and language support in the early years as a par for the course situation. So I was, you know, Early Years Scotland would certainly suggest that an increase, because we know some settings who are members of ours who have speech and language therapy regularly, which makes a world of difference to the children. So that's really important, about recognising that was a big impact on everyone. So there needs to be a bit more provision for that. There needs to be more provision in terms of training and development for early years staff about specific things. So additional support needs is a very broad term, but we are finding within the sector that more and more children are presenting with some form of additional support need, and unfortunately that's not necessarily something that's covered in depth as part of training for becoming an early years practitioner or whatever you're calling it. So just that kind of more appropriate training for that. More age-appropriate materials as well. This is something that we hear a lot, that there's a lot of really, really great resources out there to support young children's mental health or to support children with additional support needs. But a lot of the time it's for 5 and up. Children who are 0 to 5 are very different demographics. So we need to make sure that, I mean, I suppose it comes back to really just recognising the importance of the early years, but being aware that if you can get into those things early, you know, it can go some way to mitigate. It's not going to solve everything, but it'll certainly go some way to mitigate. I think as well in terms of transitions, I think we learned Earlier Scotland's always called for better enhanced transitions between ELC settings and schools, and how difficult that was during COVID has really only kind of shown how important that is. And I mean, you know, we've advocated in the past for the likes of an early years worker in schools, specific, not somebody from the school nursery, but a specific early years practitioner. So we do it. Earlier Scotland runs Primary 1 Stay Play and Learn, where we'll go into schools. They'll ask us to go in, we'll go in, and the children and their parents will come in, and we'll hold Stay Play and Learn sessions. So it's about that kind of play-based learning, and it's recognising that it's very difficult to expect a young child to go from an environment where they've got freedom and they're allowed to do a lot more, and then in 6 weeks sit them down. I remember my son saying, I don't like the trousers because they dig in, because all he'd ever wore was tracksuit bottoms. So it's little things like that you recognise that, you know, that's obviously an issue for children. So it's about transitions is a really important one, and I think it's always been difficult, but I think COVID really showed us that we could do that better. And I think the children now who went through that are okay and they're settled in school in the main. But it's a learning that, well, that could have been better anyway. Because if that was better anyway, then it wouldn't have been as bad during the pandemic, if that makes sense. And I just also think that, you know, touch wood, it never happens again. But if we did have to go through something similar where there was a raft of documents that had to be created, guidance documents, that they're just made simpler. That somebody like me shouldn't have to pick them apart and, you know, make them accessible and easy to read. That should be done already. And yeah, just so that it helps the staff, because fundamentally at the heart and the bottom in the middle of all this is the children, and it's about ensuring that they have that best start in life. Scotland, we're really committed to it as a country, and we've got some really wonderful policies around it, but we just sometimes need to think a bit better. So, you know, making sure that staff have time to do what they need to do so that they can invest the time in the children, and that play is really important and recognised, and that it's really important to allow families to come together, particularly in socio-economic disadvantaged backgrounds, come together and create those networks and meet those peers so that they can have that support going forward to really just guarantee that kind of best start for the little ones.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms Kettles. I don't have any more questions for you, my lord. I have no further questions unless there's anything that your lordship wishes to add.
Well, thank you very much indeed, yes, and thank you, Ms Kettles. I'm very grateful for your evidence.
Thank you.
Very good. We'll now take a break until 3 o'clock. Yes, no. Good afternoon, Miss van der Westerhuizen. Can you hear me?
I
Can
can,
you
my
hear me,
lord.
Miss Smith? You can. Good afternoon again.
I can. Good afternoon. My lord, we are this afternoon going to hear evidence from a panel of 3 witnesses, Ms. Rona Black, Ms. Karen Flynn and Mr. Ross Keenan, who are all operators of private, voluntary, independent nurseries and members of Early Years Scotland, from whom we've just heard evidence.
Very good. Good afternoon to you all.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Thank you for coming. Now, Miss van der Westerhuizen, when you're ready.
Thank you, my lord. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good
Afternoon.
I'm going to ask you in a moment to introduce yourselves, but I'm just going to confirm that you previously attended a round table with the inquiry. Is that correct?
Yes, we did.
Correct.
And a round table report was prepared of that meeting. And have you had sight of that round table report?
Yes, I
Yes.
have.
Thank you. Just, my lord, the number for that is SCI WT 0171 000001. And I'll just ask that to be put up on the screen, because essentially what we're doing this afternoon, my lord, is we'll be running through the agenda items that were run through at that round table and just get evidence in relation to each of those headings. So if I could ask for that to be scrolled to the end, so we can have the agenda item up on the screen in front of everyone. I think it's the appendix before that. Thank you. Well, before we start, could I please ask you all to introduce yourselves by giving your full names, the name of your setting, and an indication of the size of your setting or settings and how many, the number of settings. And if I could start perhaps first with Mr. Keenan.
Hi, my name is Ross Keenan. I'm Director of Cosmic Couples Childcare in Glasgow. At the time, pre-pandemic, we operated 3 different services, 2 children's nurseries running off of 3 locations and 1 after-school care, totalling around 250 children per day we could take into our care across all 3 settings.
And then if I could ask Ms. Flynn to come in, followed by Ms. Black.
My name is Karen Flynn. I'm the Director Stroke Area Manager of Kirkton Home Childcare. We at present have 11 settings, but at the time of the pandemic had 10, and we've also added 2 forest schools. To note, at the moment we offer care for over 1,000 children and families.
My name's Rona Black. I'm the head of the nursery and kindergarten at the Glasgow Academy Kelvin Bridge site, which is one of 3 sites in Glasgow, one in Mulgai, one in Newlands and one in the West End in Kelvin Bridge. And at Kelvin Bridge we offer a place for 84 children daily.
Thank you. If I could ask for the agenda just to be shifted up a little bit so we can get to the first item, which is, well, first item for us today, which is item 4, discussion of the key issues and impacts experienced by ELC settings and their workforce. Thank you. So just by way of how we'll run things today, there are 6 items on this agenda, and I propose to include a 7th one. On my calculations, we should be able to make it through all of them. What I'm proposing to add to the end is a discussion on the financial impacts on your settings and your businesses. That's touched on in a couple of the bullet items. So if we can save that discussion till the end and just have a standalone discussion on the financial impacts on your businesses. Just, my lord, the items we'll be covering are the closure of the settings for those who did not operate closures over closures and lockdowns. The second item is operating critical childcare services or hub settings over closures and lockdowns. The third item is operating with restriction measures throughout the pandemic period. The fourth item is subject-specific impacts on the workforce. The fifth item is subject-specific impacts on preschool children, and I'm going to be proposing that we include in that discussion impacts on the families as well, the parents and parenting, not just on the school children, preschool children. The sixth item relates to disproportionate impacts on certain groups of preschool children, and then, as I said, I propose to include a final item on financial impacts on the businesses themselves. So if I could perhaps start off the discussion by getting an indication, and again, just for the stenographer's benefit, I'll cue you in one by one, but if we could perhaps start again with Mr. Keenan, followed by Ms. Flynn, and then Ms. Black, and just get an indication of which of you closed down over the lockdowns and which of you remained open, or whether there was a combination of the two.
We initially, on the first lockdown, we looked to remain open to offer care for what was classed then as key workers, children. After a short period of time, probably a week, we decided through pressure that was being exerted by our parents and carers to close because of the options of selecting children that were eligible at the time. It became a bit of a minefield for us in terms of selecting people who were eligible or not, so we chose to close down on the first lockdown. After that, in any subsequent lockdowns, we remained open to offer care.
Thank you.
We made the decision to close all but two of our settings. The two settings that remained open was our South Ayrshire setting, and that was because South Ayrshire Council had asked us to provide a hub. So we actually provided a hub in Ayr. And our other setting was the Wishaw General Hospital setting. And we felt morally that we should keep it open. There was, North Lanarkshire Council did provide hubs in North Lanarkshire for the children. However, we felt that these children, this is the setting they know, this is the people they know, and really, it's best place for those children to be there. However, it did get fractious, just what was just said there about parents. Then there was a lot of unrest about what makes someone eligible for those places, so it was difficult.
Well, thank you very much. We'll come on to discuss that in more detail in due course. Ms. Black.
We closed our settings in Mulgai and in Newlands, and at Kelvin Bridge I remained open as a hub for those other two sites.
Thank you. And just in terms of those of you who closed, what were the impacts of ceasing to provide the usual services, such as, for example, on relationships with the families and children that you'd ordinarily remain open for?
Significant. In terms of our ability to communicate with families, it was severely impacted. Our chosen channel for communication was Facebook at the time. That was our key means of staying in contact with families and such like. So you can imagine not a lot of people were on Facebook. There was significant impact with that. And again, with it being online, there's only so much you can do via social media. You can't actually physically check on the well-being of children. So there was significant impacts with that.
Thank you.
For us, we saw huge impacts. Like what's just been said, there wasn't a lot of digital back then. We had Facebook. Our staff were doing things on Facebook for the children, meeting with the parents, but having those connections losing those connections was really worrying, because we had many children who were very vulnerable, even just before the pandemic, and that just made it even harder, because we'd lost all contact with them.
During the first lockdown, we had sporadic contact with the parents on Zoom calls and tried to maintain connection with the children during that time. But during the second lockdown, we were much better prepared, and we had daily Zoom sessions with the children and tried to establish relationships with them and maintain relationships with them on a virtual medium.
And how important was it from their perspective to
I think for the children it was very important. I think the families appreciated the time when we spoke to the children and worked with the children, reading stories, having small lessons and classes with them. I think for the families it was very important. The children loved seeing each other on the screens, and for many of my children transitioned to nursery and started their nursery days on a Zoom call, but it meant when they came to join us in reality, in person, they did have some idea of who we were, and we weren't just strangers.
And in relation to families that you maybe weren't able to contact, were there any particular concerns? And perhaps if I can start with Mr. Keegan again and work down the line.
Generally speaking, we had widespread adoption of our chosen channel of Facebook, so there weren't many, if any, families that we were disconnected with totally. Some use Facebook more than others in terms of communicating with us and what their choices of communication were. But generally speaking, we managed to maintain communication with all of our families, albeit restricted to their choice in terms of how much they wanted to communicate with us.
Thank you.
There was numerous things that we did. We did actually do Zooms as well, and the staff were doing bedtime stories and things like that with the children. But our staff took it upon it themselves for those more vulnerable children to be doing garden visits and doorstop visits and just checking in on them. And this was even when they were furloughed, that they still checked in, because we knew that we had good relationships with our families, and so we knew what the challenges were, and we knew that they would have been exasperated with homeschooling preschool children, also financial issues as well. We were already struggling financially, and knowing that their children were getting fed during the day at nursery, where all that was going. So our staff had taken it upon themselves to do wee bits and pieces just to keep checking in.
Thank you.
I think for anyone who works in childcare, lack of visibility of children is always a concern that you have if you don't know if they're ill, or so for the sustained period of time not to have connection and visibility of children will always be something that rang alarm bells potentially. I have to say most of my parents and families engaged readily with the offerings that we had, and we had visibility of most of the children, and for those other ones we sent messages or we phoned home, and we tried to keep up with them in terms of activities and things that we could send to them to engage with.
Thank you. In the roundtable report there's mention of pressure to stay open. There was substantial pressure to remain open from parents and carers. So I would just ask you each in turn to please address what policy, a concern has been raised about whether and to what extent staff might have been under a similar pressure to come into work if you chose to remain open at a particular point. So I just ask you each in turn to indicate what policies you had for staff attending if they were feeling ill, and to what extent staff might have felt pressure to come into work if they themselves were not feeling well.
Generally speaking, when the first lockdown came around and we reviewed our policy for who would be willing to come into work, we actually asked our workforce if there were any within the workforce who were subject or were classed as being vulnerable. Those were immediately excluded from expectation of working because of their own situation. We then spoke to our team in terms of those willing to basically carry on working, those who were wary of it, and we tried as much as possible to take that into account when we were trying to offer the care for the children. Again, moving on, care numbers we were taking in through the door was significantly reduced, so that became easier in the short term, but as numbers gradually increased, it became a bit more difficult. But generally speaking, we were able to fulfil everybody's needs and look after their concerns with regards to their own health and well-being.
Thank you very much.
We were very similar, and there was also staff who they might not have been vulnerable, but they had family members who were vulnerable. We had a few whose grandparents had moved in to be part of their bubble, all those things. So we took all of that into account. But again, just like it's been said, the numbers were significantly lower, so we it did allow for that flexibility.
Thank you. Ms. Black.
It's again the same. We talked to staff about who was willing to come in, who was able to come in. Perhaps they didn't have childcare for their own children necessarily readily. So it was about making sure that they felt comfortable about the amount of time and pressure that would be exerted upon them in fulfilling a rota. So I reduced their hours to make sure that they had adequate time to be with their own families and also to help out as much as they felt able to.
Thank you very much. I think if we could move on then to the next bullet item, which is operating as critical childcare services in hub settings over closures and lockdowns. And this has got a number of subtopics, including eligibility criteria, uptake of spaces, changes in responsibilities, development and training, mental health and well-being, registration requirements, and financial impact, which again, the financial impact aspect we'll discuss at the end. But if I could perhaps start this time with Ms. Flynn, and just ask you specifically in relation to the operation of critical childcare services, and all of you in turn then, what were the eligibility criteria and how were those enforced?
Well, like we were given, I'm sure back when things get a bit fuzzy, but we were given a list of criteria of what makes you a key worker. But that could be misconstrued. That could be like we had parents taking jobs as delivering Just Eat once a week, just so they got the criteria to bring their child in. So we knew they still had their day job, but if you did 2 hours a week delivering burgers, then they got the free childcare. So there was all of that. And when we had a skeleton staff, and also trying to keep our staff safe as well, because we had a responsibility to our team as well. And it then sometimes became a wee bit challenging that actually we were the ones at the front line having to take sometimes really difficult decisions, but sometimes there were parents who were really quite volatile about being a key worker.
So in relation to that, were you having to decide yourselves who did or did not qualify?
Yes.
And any input or involvement from the local authority?
No, we were on our own with it.
And if I could ask then Ms. Black and then Mr. Keenan for your input on this.
So the criteria was actually dealt with by our management team in the school, and they dealt with a lot of the inquiries from parents who wanted to know whether they were eligible or not. And some of the criteria, the way it was worded, perhaps led to a bit of debate about whether of eligibility or not. And often parents reflecting on other people's jobs and professions and whether they felt that was a suitable eligible category or not. It created a bit of dubiety, I think, amongst parents. And they wanted the best for their children. They didn't want to be having their children at home while they were trying to work. And they were in a quandary themselves. How am I going to look after my child adequately and suitably when I'm trying to do a job? So there was a lot of personal angst, I think, brought about by it.
Thank you. And Mr. Keenan?
I think connecting to what Karen and Lorna said as well, the financial impact on a lot of our parents was such that it brought a huge amount of pressure on them. That pressure was subsequently redirected towards their childcare settings. We sat and decided who was basically in and who wasn't in, to the extent of I had people on the phone to me shouting and screaming down the phone that their wife was eligible when in fact we knew she wasn't, and it was making relationships very, very difficult at that point as well, because they felt the pressure, and likewise were putting us under an awful lot of pressure. I think the key thing for us making decisions was the sourcing of information on who was eligible at any given time. At one point, it was left up to us to basically go on and troll the internet to get viable lists of who was eligible, who wasn't eligible. Those lists differed in Scotland from England on a lot of the occasions, and sometimes only information you could get was from information that was eligible in England, so you took the best information you could get and tried to apply that. And I think the frustration on our part a lot of the times was whether we were actually right or not in taking a standpoint in that, and that was very, very difficult at the time.
And just in terms of children being allocated to hub settings, were any of, for your settings, were any children allocated to your hub settings that were not children who you, or to your settings were not children who'd normally attend? And if I could start maybe in reverse order with Mr. Keenan, because you've just finished speaking.
Yep, we had all of our children were children registered with us. We didn't take, there was no other children coming into us from other settings at all.
Thank you. Ms. Flynn.
In our hub setting in Ayrshire, we had children we didn't know. Most of the children we didn't know. Some of them being school age as well. So that was a whole different, we had to resource, we had to do all of these things for them because it was a preschool setting. But we had children who were school age up to the age of P7 with us.
I just had children who came from our school setting.
Well, then perhaps I could turn back to you, Ms. Flynn, and ask you just were there any specific, we'll obviously come on to discuss impacts on children, but in relation to the children who were allocated to your hub setting that were maybe not ones that you were familiar with, were there any particular issues for them or for yourselves?
Was the not knowing, like their whole world had been turned upside down, and then they were asked, they were taken out their own out of school care and brought to us. They didn't know us, they didn't know anybody, like, and they came from all different schools as well, so it wasn't as though it was just, you know, that wee hub from that school. There might have been 5 or 6 schools that they came from, so there was huge impacts. Yes, they were old enough to build relationships and all of those things, but when you actually, your world's upside down as it is, you're not going to school, now you're not going to your out of school care, and you're going to this place where you don't know and you don't know anyone, and you've got a workforce that only knows early years and has just had to adapt.
And before I move on to everyone else, in terms of, you mentioned there the increased workload, what was that like, and what steps did you have to take to accommodate operating as a hub for children who weren't ones that ordinarily attended?
It was more the fact of thinking outside the box to what would meet the needs of the children. Because when you're used to just having those preschool children, you know what meet the needs, but all of a sudden, you've got all these school-age children. So it wasn't just what can I do with them to keep them occupied, to keep them happy, but it was well, what resources are we going to use? Where are we going to get? Everywhere's closed, do you know? But actually, give my staff their due. It was them that was like, I've got this in the house and I've got that in the house, and we'll bring all this, and we kind of all just pulled together for the workforce to get them resources that would help.
And just before moving on from this topic, just in terms of staff sort of mental health and well-being, what, if any, impacts were there on that as a consequence of having to operate as, or choosing to operate as hub settings? And perhaps I can start with Ms. Black and then move back up the line.
I think for my staff who worked in the hub together, it made us a very tight team. It certainly bonded us together in trying to make the best experience for the children, both the ones we had in the hub and also remotely. So we worked really hard to make that the best possible experience in both environments. And I think it made us a very strong team. It was a positive thing for us as a staff.
Yeah, I would mirror that. It was very positive because you were relying on each other more than you ever did before. I think the only negative came is when they were split into bubbles. But when they were all able to work together, then it was really good.
And Mr. Keenan, for you.
I would echo what my colleagues have said there. The connection between the staff teams grew stronger. They connected, even though in the first lockdown where they weren't actually physically in, they connected over social media and spent a lot of time with their work colleagues as well as their family groups. Generally speaking, we were very cognizant of the mental health areas, that we made sure the staff team were okay, were coping okay. If any had any specific concerns, we were trying to address them as much as possible. Generally speaking, our staff coped admirably well with it. We didn't have any real dramas, I feel like, as a result of it. They stuck together very well.
Thank you. If we could perhaps then move on just to discuss operating with restriction measures throughout the pandemic period. And this incorporates things such as keeping up to date with guidance, wearing of face masks, enhanced cleaning and hygiene, restrictions on play practices, toy rotation, restrictions on parental engagement, and restrictions on the use of blended places. If I could start specifically in relation to keeping up to date with guidance as a standalone topic, and perhaps start with you, Ms. Flynn, and then Mr. Keenan, and then Ms. Black, and then we can come back round and discuss any of the others that were issues for you.
With regards to guidance, that was hugely challenging because it changed so quickly, so often. It just seemed like every Thursday night there was another change to the guidance. But at the beginning, when the guidance came out, it was just, pieces were just added to it, but you didn't know what the addition was. So every week you were going through screeds and screeds of paperwork, trying to work out what was there last week or what wasn't there last week that's there this week. Eventually, I'm sure it ended up getting highlighted in blue, any changes. But even the stress of sitting, and that was one of my main jobs, was sitting, churning through this every week, because you're thinking, I've got the responsibility of all these staff, all these children, and all these families on my shoulders, and if we do it wrong, then it comes back to us. I would say that was probably one of the worst parts of it. Sorry, I'm getting a bit...
Mr. Keenan, perhaps we can move on to you.
I think, again, keeping up with the guidance was a huge demand on our time. Fortunately, we're a family business. My wife dealt with that in terms of that, and then it brought up discussion. Hugely challenging. The fact that we were expected to move on to these things almost immediately, there was a huge amount of pressure. I think that was born through our willingness to be compliant, but again, there was an unknown, there was grey areas there in terms of some of the things you were doing. Were they compliant? What would be the punishment, if you like, for not being compliant? That was huge. There was an awful lot of it we felt was changing without our knowing as well, and at times being unsustainable. That was a huge pressure on us, huge.
Thank you. Ms. Black.
I think there was a lot of guidance, undoubtedly, and I think, you know, in early years, and when you're dealing with little vulnerable children, you want to get things right immediately. You want to know that something's important and you follow through. So there was a lot of pressure and a lot of new information coming out, and it was a lot to keep on top of.
And then, related to guidance, just to ask when settings were open beyond critical care, what were some of the restrictions and measures imposed that were either good or bad or particularly problematic for you? And if I could perhaps start with Mr. Keenan this time.
I think the biggest initial one coming in was the implementation of bubbles, where we had to isolate the children and staff to be able to manage the bubbles. Not only isolate the children and staff, but find spaces within the nurseries that were able to be segregated as such to keep the children and staff in their own separate bubbles. Picking who went into each bubble was a huge issue, because from that you use your knowledge of the children, who they are familiar with when they attend nursery. Off the back of that, there was significant pressure from parents to assign children to specific groups where the parents thought the children would be best suited. So you were looking at social groups out with nursery as opposed to social groups within nursery. Huge pressure with that. The actual physical segregation of the nurseries was a huge issue, and a very, very costly issue for us all. In terms of being able to cope with that, that was probably the biggest challenges. Uncertainty in terms of what you were able to do to create a bubble, who was eligible to go into a bubble. There was, certainly for myself, I know that the number of children within the bubble was hugely problematic to us, and we were restricted to that at the start as well, which hugely took down your ability to operate at capacity or within numbers that you were used to. So that was a huge issue for us.
Thank you. Ms. Flynn, you'd mentioned bubbles already. Please feel free to expand on that and or to mention any of the other
the bubbles were hugely challenging, absolutely hugely challenging, because it was like it's already been said, we had parents who, we were splitting the children into their friendship groups of those children that they played with on a day-to-day basis in nursery. However, parents didn't see that because they saw who they played with at the park in their social groups, and that caused so much unrest. But also the staff then had to get split up in their breaks. They had to use separate toilets. They had to, so where we had all that camaraderie before, where the staff stuck together like a wee tight-knit community, they were all separated, so they were vulnerable. They were like, they didn't have their friends to sit at a break with. And at some points, were sitting on breaks on their own. So they were working all day, 8 hours a day, with just one group of children and just them. And then they couldn't even sit in the break and have a conversation. And that, to me, is when the mental health issue began hitting the staff, and they really began to crumble in that.
Thank you. We'll perhaps touch on mental health issues in a moment, but Ms. Black, if you could come in on
so the problems with bubbles were such that we were only allowed to have 32 children in one of our rooms, but actually at that time my register was 48 children, so 16 children had to be located somewhere else or not come to nursery. So it was never a question that we would say to 16 children, you can't come in. So we found, initially we started in the garden with 16 children in the garden in probably one of the coldest winters, and after a while that became unsustainable because it was just so cold, and the school found us an alternative space indoors. We created a nurture room for the children and we had a space for them there, and it's a lovely space, and we resourced it for that. But 16 children in a garden, doing all sorts of dancing and singing, trying to keep warm, and the 12 Days of Christmas song acted out was a highlight, I would say, but not perhaps the best, because we were two members of staff had to be outdoors whilst the other staff team were indoors working in bubbles.
Thank you. Just before we move away and looking at issues in relation to the workforce and staffing, we've heard a little bit today about transitions and issues with, or you know, the importance of transitions. Could I perhaps start with you, Ms. Black, and then move down the line again, just to ask if there were any particular concerns or issues in relation to transitions during the time when you were operating with restrictions?
So for the new intake that were coming to me, I came in during the summer holiday and actually toured children and their parents around the nursery in an empty space with no children, toys all tidied away, and with mothers who perhaps hadn't left their children with anyone at all before that. They were having to entrust their child to, well, me, who they'd met, but also other staff who they weren't going to meet during that induction visit. So the transition became a very trusted experience. Parents had to put an enormous amount of trust in us, leaving their most precious thing at a gateway or a doorway with people who they really hadn't made a connection with as an adult. And we were expected then to take their most precious thing and develop a relationship with them going forward, and know that we were doing the right thing for everybody and working together. So transitions were, I think, probably one of the hardest things for the children. When they did come in, they established relationships with the staff very quickly. Because they hadn't been around a lot of other adults, and all of a sudden there were all these new play resources and new people to play with. So the settling session became a shorter period, I would say, for children, but transitions were particularly challenging.
Thank you. Ms. Flynn.
Yeah, I mirror that too. We're at a different club. We've got Scotland's youngest children, so we've got, I think about 400 babies in our care. So that was massive. That was, do you know, really, really difficult, because we very much, the way in which at Kirkton Home we do our transitions is it can take up to 6 months. We encourage parents when they're on maternity and paternity leave to come and do stay in plays for as long as they want. It could go months on end until they're ready to go to work, and then that's when we do the settling. So all of that was obviously gone, just like Rona says about taking babies off parents at doors. Like, and we did evening visits. We would never, like Rona, would never have anybody hand your baby into a nursery and you've not actually never been over the door. So we did do evening visits. We also did stay in plays in the garden. So yeah, it never went on because it was winter months. It never went on as long as we would generally have done it. But we did do it. We encouraged the parents to just come and play, do you know, with us to try and get it that wee bit better. But for children, that was a huge impact.
Thank you. And Mr. Keenan?
Transitions in terms of new children coming on board or coming into the nursery wasn't particularly a challenge for us, because we were struggling to provide our existing register with the care required. So we didn't actually bring on a lot of new children as such. We were so restricted in our numbers in terms of putting them into bubbles that we couldn't. The additional transition from that as well is from age group to age group as it moves up through the nursery. By and large, we tried to maintain the children in their age groups, even though maybe encroached over the recognised age group by a couple of months, to just try and keep them within their own bubble that they were familiar with as much as possible. We tried to restrict that as much as possible as well. Any new transitions towards the end of the pandemic were dealt with via Zoom calls in the afternoon or evening visits, so that they could come in and meet the managers on site. And again, it was about the managers on site dealing with parents, becoming a face that they knew. But in terms of the actual staff members that would look after the child, we tended to keep that to a minimum. It would just purely be senior managers speaking to parents who are going to bring in new kids towards the end of the pandemic. Certainly not when there was bubbles in operation, because we just didn't have the space. I had still had children sitting at home that were on our register that couldn't come to nursery, so ringing in any new children just wasn't an option for us.
Thank you. If we could perhaps now turn just to look at specific impacts on the workforce, such as qualifications, experience, recruitment and retention, integrated working with other services, vaccine prioritisation, access to PPE, regulation and inspection, and the expansion of funded hours. Perhaps we won't have time to go through all of those, but Ms. Flynn, you mentioned mental health, so perhaps we could start with mental health, then discuss qualifications, experience, recruitment and retention, if there are any particular issues with that, and regulation and inspection, and if there's time, then working with other services, perhaps, I think is something that we could touch on as well. So perhaps if we can start with mental health with you, Ms. Flynn.
Was at the point of the bubble, like I said previously, the point at that bubbles, at that point, we started to see the staff starting to struggle. They just weren't, and it'd been a long time as well, and their personal life, they'd gone through so much as well, and they'd been in work and out of work, and it definitely had that impact on them, and they were then starting to become off sick more, and just struggling, just needing, that wee bit extra. So that's where we were with mental health. I mean, do you want me to go on and speak about qualifications, or do you want to do mental health first?
We'll finish mental health, and then we'll come back around on that. I think maybe Ms. Black, if you could go next.
I think for the staff who were working in the hubs and things, it was easier for them to remain positive. They had the camaraderie of a team, and perhaps the ones who were at home would find that slight disconnect from, and it really was up to managers in those settings to keep the staff going in terms of contact and in connection with them. And I know some of my colleagues, had weekly Zoom meetings and quiz nights and different things with their staff, and different sort of social events online to try and maintain that connectivity and to remain you know, in touch with them and to make sure that check in on them as much as possible.
Thank you. And Mr. Keenan.
Mental health during their time on shift, I think, for our teams was a bit easier for us, certainly in one setting, because of the nature of our settings. It is generally open plan. The segregation still meant that they could see the rest of their teammates within the playrooms, so communication and such like as they would normally get it whilst restricted to a degree wasn't totally removed. Echoing what Karen had said, you would get staff members going in on a tea break and sitting in isolation, so naturally a tea break is a time for them to have a chat and such like. That was obviously reduced. Generally speaking, I thought our staff team did an admirable job in terms of maintaining their mental health. There was certain aspects of, as you would get with any workforce, some being more vulnerable than others, in which we tried to address that. But generally speaking, they did a reasonable job with it.
Thank you. If we could then turn and probably start with Ms. Flynn again on qualification experience and recruitment and retention, if there were any issues or subsequent issues with that.
There was huge issues, but the pandemic came the same time as an expansion in early learning and childcare, so it's kind of difficult to separate both. But with a definite impact was the qualifications and the experienced workforce, because because of the expansion, we've got a whole new workforce now, and they're all a very young workforce. So that workforce then were doing a qualification through a pandemic, or they maybe never have finished their formal education, like school education, because of a pandemic. So they had missed a huge chunk of their education, whether it be at school or whether it be at college or with their training provider, because a lot of the college qualified practitioners didn't get an opportunity to be in nursery and have that practical experience. And then others were, if it was like an SVQ qualification they did where it's very work-based, they had some online classes, but they weren't to the calibre of what they should have got just due to circumstances. So so we're still dealing with it now. There's a huge gap in knowledge and experience that we are having to now go back and plug. So we're having to take qualified staff back and doing training that they would or should have got at college or with their training provider.
Thank you. Ms. Black, I don't know if you have anything on that.
We had some recruitment which took place during the lockdown, and online interviews which we weren't accustomed to doing with staff. And when they then came in to work in the room, it was a different experience. It wouldn't be our normal way of running things. We were operating a hub, so things were different. But the staff were able to mentor each other quite readily because we had smaller numbers of children, and we were able to explain things. And for them to integrate was a different experience, but it was a better experience in terms of having access to things. But I think I know that the expansion happening at the same time has had huge demands on staffing and the availability of staff, good and well qualified staff across the sector.
Thank you. And Mr. Keenan.
The recruitment of staff, generally speaking, we found the desire of our staff members to move on to other environments wasn't there. They wanted a bit of stability during COVID, obviously with the impact of furlough as well. If they did move, sometimes they weren't eligible for furlough. That tended to slow up the process. By and large, just to echo what my colleagues have said as well, the introduction of the expansion of funded hours was the biggest impact, because what you'd had in terms of impacting the private sector was that local authorities had in effect harvested all the experience and staff from the private sector to cope with the expansion introduced to 1140 hours. That left us, as Karen had said, with an extremely young, inexperienced workforce, And again, Karen's mentioned it previously before, the level of experience left within the private sector severely impacted our ability to nurture and bring on and teach the new recruits coming into the sector, maybe from school and such like. So that has had a significant impact, and is still having a significant impact on certainly the private sector, because basically there's been an exodus of experienced staff and a huge level of competent staff moving from private to the local authority, and that's been a huge impact on us, really huge.
Can I just add that we've, just to put it into context, we've lost over 200% of our workforce. Wow. So we sit with about 150 practitioners, and we've lost something today, about 350 since the pandemic.
And what impact has that had on children?
Massive. Because these children, this is their people, this is their safety, it's those relationships that have been built, it's just a rotation continuously, and the problem being just what Ross had said about the new young workforce. It's not their fault, but when you've got a full young workforce, there's no one to learn from, like, because they're all at the same level. But that's had a massive impact to the children, because it's like they don't know we get paid to take care of them and love them and play with them. They just think we're their aunties and their uncles and all of these things, and then all of a sudden, every week, there's someone else going. And it's had a huge impact to the families as well, because they think they build that trust in people, and then all of a sudden, their people are going.
Thank you. Perhaps we can touch on briefly regulation and inspection, and if there were any issues around that for any of you, and we can perhaps start with Ms. Black and move back down the line.
So we did not have any inspections at that time. We weren't due for an inspection, so it was following the last period of lockdown and of restrictions. We had an inspection from HMI. It was a recovery inspection from Education Scotland came in, and then following that, last year we had an inspection from Care Inspectorate, but nothing during the time of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Flynn.
We had a few. We had about 10 settings at the time. It was a huge challenge. I would say it's a huge challenge because we were firefighting. That's all we did for, it feels like 2 years. We fought fires. In fact, we're still fighting some today. But when you don't have a digital system, when you're working in bubbles and bubbles go down because one child has COVID or an adult, we felt as though we were in nurseries every single night of the week, going through everybody's forums, phoning every parent, letting them know. That was our day-to-day, and then keeping everyone safe and those children happy. But then we were getting inspected throughout it. We got a key question 5 inspection about keeping children safe and healthy, and of course we've got to make sure that children are safe and healthy. However, one inspection was in person, but at that point Care Inspector weren't allowed in for more than 2 hours, so you had to send stuff to them. Another inspection, we had one of our managers going about with a tablet round the whole nursery, being questions fired at them, and then others it's just on the phone. It was all very different, but at a time, well, the first part, our Care Inspector were phoning us weekly, checking in, how are you doing, do you need anything, what can we do to help? But very quickly that changed, and we were then being inspected, and I still feel bitter to this day that was put on upon us at that time. We did have a HMI, an Education Scotland recovery visit, which was very positive, and Education Scotland sold it to us as we're here to listen and learn. We want to know before we can fully out and inspect. We want to know what you went through, what the impacts were, all of this. But I felt that with Care Inspectorate, we got the opposite. It was making us feel guilty for not doing things maybe not 100% right. But we were juggling all these children, all these families and all these staff and doing the best we possibly could at that time. And can I just say, without masks, without, like, do you know, because we never wore masks. We never, because these children needed to see us. They needed to see our facial expressions. They needed to see smiles, all of these things. So we and our staff teams put ourselves out there where everyone else was all masked up and gowned up. When we had speech and language come through the door, they put a hat on, never even took their coat off, put a hat on, a blue apron, gloves, and then went in and was supposed to be doing speech and language with children. There was huge implications, all these things.
Thank you, and we'll probably touch on services now, and if I could just ask Mr. Keenan just to finish off on the inspections issue.
I think generally speaking, the relationship with Care Inspectorate quickly moved. We didn't initiate or have any initiated contact with Care Inspectorate at the start of the outbreak. Our contact with them came subsequently after, when we had outbreaks within the sites. We had 2 inspections in both of our services, one via phone and one in person. Both of them resulted in some tweaks being made, which subsequently we've found are questionable. For example, putting a brand new window in a stairway because of ventilation issues, which we've now found out the ventilation issues were questionable. We found it to be quite adversarial at points. Going back to a point that we'd previously made about the guidance being issued and our willingness to be able to adhere to the guidance, but also an inherent fear that you weren't be able to follow the guidance, that would therefore be looked dimly upon by the Care Inspectorate when you were inspected. There was a level of real fear, if you like, certainly the provider's point of view, that we were doing the right thing when you had so much information to wade through, and invariably things would be missed, but not. We were doing everything with the best of intentions, but sometimes things slipped, and there was just always the fear there that you'd be punished for it as such. So.
Thank you. Well, perhaps Ms. Flynn touched on it, and if I could start with you, Mr. Keenan, it feeds into the next subject, which is impacts on children. But before we leave the topic we're on now, if we could touch on just working with other services and how that worked, and if there were any issues in relation to that.
I think we could all agree they practically stopped. I mean, to be totally, we didn't have huge amounts of additional support needs within our establishments as it was. There was maybe less than 20, but the support that we had at the time pre-COVID almost disappeared. There was nothing to speak of in terms of any support for the kids. There is one child in particular who was transitioning to school, who, in our opinion, shouldn't have been going to school and actually should have been going to a supported learning establishment, whose support dropped off a cliff, and there was nothing there for the family, and I think that was a real concern for us. But generally speaking, any support that we got, speech and language, that type of thing, just practically disappeared for us. And again, that in turn brought additional pressures to our staff teams, because they were expected to kind of pick up the weight of it from there, and they're just not trained for it. They'll do the best they can, but they're certainly not trained specialist trained in that aspect of it. So there was huge amounts of pressure on us from that aspect. But that was certainly our experience, that it practically disappeared.
Thank you. Ms. Flynn.
I just mirror that. There was very little. It was speech and language for us had come back nearer the end, but it was, like it says, like all gowned up as though they were going to perform surgery, and it stood against a wall in a playroom. Now, there was nothing for that child. There was no connection. There was no, like, it's hard enough getting the children to feel safe and feel supported, and then all those restrictions just added to that, because we were doing our utmost to make sure we were having nurturing environments. But it wasn't when the other service, like Rose said, the other services kind of more or less disappeared until towards the end.
Thank you. And Ms Black?
We had very little workings with other services at that time, but the few that we had, the visits took place in the garden. The visiting staff were happy to meet the children in the garden and outdoor setting.
Thank you very much. If we could then turn and just get some evidence from each of you on impacts on preschool children, such as, for example, social and emotional development, motor skills, language and communication, play, independence and confidence, routine and structure, feeding, eating, relationships, sleeping, personal skills, separation anxiety, transitions to primary school, and any positive impacts. And perhaps if I could start with you, Ms Black, and we can work back up the line. There's a lot in there, so please feel free to pick out as many as...
I think it's very obvious that the children have lost a lot of experience and understanding of and social interaction template, seeing their parents interact with their friends, adult friends, seeing their parents interact with professional services, with even going to shops with their children, visiting the doctor with their children, going to museums and cafes. Lots of the children hadn't been anywhere other than within the four walls of their own homes. And for them, learning to share a space, a different space, resources, time, share people with other little children has been a huge learning miss in terms of how much time when they're not in nursery, they need these things, they need these interactions. Children need to develop their own independence away from home. They need to develop connections and relationships with adults, and their families need that support and that network of friendships and that network of trusting relationships that they can build with not only with us as professionals, but also with other parents going through the same experiences and shared. They didn't have things like toddlers, mother and baby groups, even the health clinic where they might have chatted to other mothers going through similar situations. And I think that this is where the children haven't seen their parents reacting and interacting the way that they normally would with other people. And with the best will in the world, you know, four walls and a screen with us talking to them hasn't made up that gap.
I meant to say in relation to impacts on children, please feel free to add any impacts on parents and parenting under that discussion as well.
I think the confidence of often as a first-time mum with your first child, you know, you need that connection with other people who are going through the same experience, and somebody, you know, perhaps phoning you and asking if you're all right isn't the same as somebody sitting, looking at you and talking to you and sharing that experience, and just being able to chat informally with other people going through the same experiences, so that you can share that and you don't feel you're being questioned or judged, or you can just be open and you can see other people's children and your children interacting and recognise the differences and the similarities between their age and stage of development and how they play and interact and move.
Thank you. Ms Flynn.
A lot of the same, a lot of, for the parents' view, absolutely, you can see that lack of connection with other young parents themselves. I think we see it a lot on, we've got so many social media platforms, and you see young parents asking in parent groups questions about children's health and taking advice from other parents. And to me that shows, and it's always, I've got a 4-year-old, I've got a 5-year-old, and you think that's our lockdown children. They're not speaking properly yet, should I be worried? And the other parents are giving advice back and saying, no, don't worry, you're okay. And you're thinking, oh my goodness, speak to your health visitor, but they never had all of that. If they'd had all of that on the way up, then they'd be reaching out to their health visitor or their GP or the nursery or the school, and not on social media. So I think massive impact to young families. With the children, yeah, in development, especially speech and language development, there are huge impacts. That comes back to the masks. A lot of it comes back to masks, or being sat in front of a screen because their parents may be homeschooling their older siblings, or they're trying to work from home. what they're doing is just sitting them down. As soon as I put them in the pram, they're handing them a phone. They're all of these things. We've got children with American accents because all they see is YouTube and American things on TV or on their screens. I know, but the masks as well, that lack of seeing those facial expressions, seeing all of those movements in their mouth, all the things that bring about good speech and language development. I would say that physically and emotionally, some children with emotional, but physically we were very outdoors. We still are very outdoors. We've never been back in. So they've been climbing trees, they've been doing all these things. So they actually are very physically well. Relationships can be a hit and a miss as well, because it depends on what their experience has been. So there's some children that really still are quite emotional and haven't got that maturity in relationships where they should be. So there is definite impacts to them. But the biggest positive being they were outdoors, and that's a place to be.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Keenan?
In terms of the children we got, we had a mixed bag, really. There was a lot of positives, certainly from the first lockdown, where support from the nursery was totally removed, and it was basically the family on their own. I think there was an awful lot of guilt from a parent's perspective, because if mum and dad or either or had to sit and work during the day, then what do you do with a 3-year-old? There's not a lot you can do. We experienced huge amounts of children coming in after the first lockdown who are incapable of playing. Couldn't do it unless you gave them a phone or an iPad. They could do that. That was no problem. Their diet, again, it was what was quick and easy for mum or dad because of their specific circumstances. There was certainly a huge amount of guilt amongst parents with regards to that. We got real positives. They came in back from the first lockdown having toilet trained, and they were brilliant. They could go to the toilet because mum or dad had time to actually focus on this, and their relationships got a bit tighter as well. So we had a huge amount of success with that. But just to echo Karen and Lorna, the speech and language element of it, when there were specific issues with that, mum and dad maybe didn't know how to deal with it. There was specialist assistance required. They had no access to it. So there were specific things like that. I think we put some numbers on it, and I think our needs for speech and language rose, I think around 30% coming back from the first lockdown. But generally speaking, just children's ability to play was a huge thing, because they were so used to just playing themselves. And when they get in amongst a crowd again, there was splits, bits and bobs of antisocial behaviour and such, like, you just weren't used to it. But that quickly moved on. We tried to rectify that after the first lockdown, when we did shut down again, and we provided an environment for them to come in and get an escape from home, if you like. So,
just before moving away from children, were there any disproportionate, or any groups of children particularly disproportionately affected? For example, children experiencing poverty, care experienced children, children from minority ethnic backgrounds, children with additional support needs, children in one-parent families, and children in rural areas that you were aware of from amongst those with your cohort?
The biggest impact would have been additional support needs. ASN was the biggest impactor. We have our settings are very different demographics in terms of the parents we have. We didn't experience anything that was particular to either or. The biggest impact was ASN, definitely, absolutely.
Thank you.
I would agree. Children with additional support for learning needs have been really, left.
I think it's harder for us to access. There's a huge backlog now, on the back of what's happened, and often families don't know their health visitor. That hasn't been something that someone who they've connected with, so it can be a bit harder to access support needs readily.
Thank you. And then finally, obviously you're all business owners or operating businesses. The financial impacts as a consequence of the restrictions that were in place, and if I could perhaps start with you, Mr. Keenan.
with these start? The one positive came out from us is the support we got initially if you were in partnership with your local authority. From a business owner, if we didn't receive the support from the local authority that we got through partnership, so we are allocated partnership funding for every 3 to 5 child up to a level. If we didn't receive that funding, we wouldn't be operating now. We wouldn't be operating post-pandemic. By my reckoning, we could have survived probably 3 months into the full lockdown. We had financial reserves to survive 3 months. That was pre-furlough. When furlough was introduced, I've said it before, I'll say it again, quite happy to say it, I cried that night. It was terrible. From that perspective, we moved on. I think the thing that really got us was the expectation of not local authorities, but the government for us to open up, operate within the restrictions that they had placed upon us without the financial assistance. The financial assistance, I know certainly in our settings, we had to spend tens of thousands to become compliant within the guidance that was issued in terms of putting up perspex walls, putting up traffic light systems, buying in outdoor classrooms. All of that was done at a significant financial expense to us in normal circumstances. We were faced with circumstances that our income was down 80%, sometimes up to 85, 90%. And I think a 4-month period, our income was down 85%. So that in itself had a huge financial impact on it. We got the funding from the local authority, which we'll be forever grateful for, but the expectation was huge on us to be able to do these things. And I'm sure there was private operators who were financially in a worse state than we were. Not everybody has got 3 months of reserve. They don't. Some operate month to month. If that wasn't done, there wouldn't have been a private childcare sector for us to open back up with. It would have disappeared. So that, again, is a slight positive. But I think there was probably more that could have been done to run in parallel with the expectations of the private sector. We need to provide this, but there was no concern as to how financially we were to be able to foot that bill, to be able to do that. And that was a huge concern for us right through the pandemic in terms of being able to survive financially. The bubbles being introduced where you were registered for 115 or 89 children, you could take 30% of your register at one point. So that in itself was a huge impact on us, huge.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mirror what Rosie said. On top of talking about the bubbles, that you didn't just have your member of staff for the bubbles. You needed the staff then to give them breaks. So over and above, you had to have more staff. When I go back to my hospital site nursery that we decided to keep open, it cost us to keep open. It cost tens of thousands to keep open because, yeah, as I said right at the beginning, it was a morally right thing to do, but it blocked us out of grants. It blocked us out of everything because we had opened it. So it did cost us. We don't regret doing it because we did it for the children and the families of that service, but there was huge implications. It actually had massive financial implications on services.
Thank you.
I'm very lucky because I operate under the umbrella of the school, so we did receive monies for the children attending the hubs from the council, and we had to fill in registers for that, and we also received government local authority funding as well, which came from the government, towards grants for reopening and to keep us in compliance with all the regulations.
Thank you.
Look, can I just add to that as well? Something that's widely forgotten as well is that we were, at the outset of it, we actually asked parents that if they could and they were able to, if they wanted to continue to pay our fees, then we would be, in order for us to survive, they would do that. And there was a significant portion of our parents who were happy to actually keep paying their fees, because at that point it was an unknown quantity. How long were we going to be closed? How long is it going to last? We want to make sure that the nursery is going to be there for us to reopen again. These were all valid concerns of not only myself running the business, but parents who needed the service to run when they went back to work. And that's a very positive thing for us, that there was a huge amount of parents actually said, no, we'll keep paying our fees. Our landlords turning around and saying to us, listen, don't worry about your rent, because we know you're closed down, but you still get the cost to pay. Without that, and without their understanding, again, would have been significant barriers to us surviving the pandemic. So in terms of that, people's goodwill in these situations certainly came to the fore.
Thank you all very much, my Lord. I have no further questions for the panel, unless your Lordship does.
No questions for me, but can I thank all the 3 panel members for their very helpful contribution. I'm very grateful. That brings an end to today's proceedings, and we commence tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. So until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, good evening everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.